So let's say, for instance, you are a growth person, you are the first growth person in a business. Is that something you would advocate for? And if that is the case, how do you suggest somebody sort of is successful without kind of getting bogged down in the sort of day-to-day? Because all this sort of strategy, execution, testing, it's a hell of a job, isn't it?
Yeah. If you're early and you're the first person working in growth at your company, I mean, there has to be a first, right? I mean, at every company I've been at, I've been the first growth person. And some of those companies have scaled cross-functional growth teams and some of them haven't, where I've stayed lone wolf and I've grabbed other resources to help me. And both of them can work. But I think the thing that helps folks be successful, in my opinion, is two things. One is that they really need to be skilled at zooming out, reviewing the model to find opportunities, and then ruthlessly prioritizing and saying no to basically everything else that's a distraction. I feel like that's the booby trap that I see a lot of people like fall into. Is all of a sudden they're hired as the first growth person. Everybody at the company is like, oh, great, here's a growth idea, here's a growth idea, here's a growth idea. And they just run from project to project trying to appease people. And it happens all the time. It's like a really common pattern that I hear in my coaching business. And they kind of get swept up in the moment without really taking a step back and figuring out what's the one or two things I need to focus on to really be successful growing this business. And then how do I politely say no to everything else because I need to do these things and it's not going to be easy, right? There's a reason why you get hired in growth. It's because there's some serious challenges. So I think you need to ruthlessly prioritize. And then I feel like the other piece is maybe two other pieces. One, I feel like you need to be really skilled at understanding what level of investment to make in these projects. So let's say you work at a company, you zoom out, you look at the model, you understand maybe the two levers you want to pull on the most. And then within those two levers, what do you do and how much effort and resources do you invest in this stuff? And so I think it's someone who has the mindset of, let me invest the smallest amount of resources possible, and let me set some guardrails to understand, am I on the right track or not? And then that feedback loop helps you to either grab more resources or figure out if you should pivot before you waste months and months over investing in something that may not have been the right solution. So I think that those are the two things that I would start with. And then the last piece, this is another booby trap, is you always need to be explaining to other folks what growth is and what you're focused on and why. It's like the number one thing outside of figuring out what you should focus on is making sure that you tell everybody else, here's what I'm doing in growth, because everybody has a different definition of what growth is or opinion on what growth should do, or thinking this isn't a growth project, stay out of my lane. And so if you're not communicating, you risk being misaligned and bumping into these other teams. And ultimately, I think that those are some of the challenges that if you haven't been in this type of role before, you might not know about.
Yeah, and I guess some of those come from experience, don't they? I would have thought that the hardest one, certainly hearing you talk about it, is just knowing when to invest, how much to invest, how much resource to put behind a particular idea. Because I think a lot of people's tendencies tend to have the mindset of, right, let's explore something as much as we possibly can, because that's kind of what we're taught in a way, isn't it? If you're going to accomplish something, do it to the best of your ability and go as deep as you possibly can. Whereas almost what you're saying is you tentatively go into it and see what's happening and then sort of decide. It reminds me of being at a blackjack table or something.
Yeah, or it's not even that you have to understand, but maybe to validate earlier. Like before you actually go and build something and grab an engineer and say, hey, I'm going to build this new experience, validate it a little bit, do some user testing, run it through a few feedback loops, whether internally or with customers, but do some things to understand if you're on the right track before you just keep plowing ahead. And again, I've made this mistake. It's super easy to make. I was working on a referral program. I was working with this engineer. It was sick. They made the sickest referral program. There's all these cool bells and whistles. The in-app experience was great. We had all of this animations when you hovered and it did this and the coin and the piggy bank and all this really fun stuff. And at its core, it wasn't that effective as a thing. And we overinvested probably on the building side of things because we just didn't know. We should have validated it and ran it through a few folks first and at least got feedback on the model that we were going to be implementing and figure out maybe if folks were likely to refer. There's just things like that. There's a million examples like that of projects that you just don't know what you don't know. And so the early validation and the early feedback is like so important.
Well, I think we've all been there. And actually, with no code tools, it's amazing how far you can get these days to just sort of iterate and test on your own. It's a lot easier than it used to be, really.